The Hebrew is much simpler than the English. When we have an expression like the look of shame here in translation, we would find in the Hebrew something like the red face, the blush, which is actually a curious phenomenon even on the human level. We have difficulty sometimes in concealing a lie or a shame. The body, against our will, betrays us, the red cheeks, which is interesting. The Psalm too has something of that, where it talks about those condemned to die. In the Hebrew it talks about sons of death. And the Gospel is supremely concrete. The parallel between Matthew and Luke on this point is interesting. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, says Matthew, and we have in Luke, be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful, giving a specificity to the perfection. And the theme of this Gospel is mercy, and a specific mercy again related to compassion in our look into the soul of another, and the expression of that judgment, which is where I want to land. But first I want to quote, since this is the Chronicle of the Merry of Priests, a passage which is very dense. You'll see why in a minute. The other day there was a ring at the door and a large beard came in, and behind it Father Michael Marr. And his beard worked overtime for 2 hours as we put the world and the church back in its place. And he gave me this epistle by post, complete with a missile, a DVD, which he wanted me to see, share, and eventually share with you. So wait for it. And he quotes here, as he is often doing, things to be looked at and meditated on in the messages of Father Gobi. Here we have one which was given in 1987 in Akita in Japan, which of course is important, as you know, and it's also approved, as you know. And we know also from Pope Benedict that the message of Akita and the message of Fatima, the third secret, are the same. And discreetly he's dropping a hint that what we can't fully hear, we can hear fully at Akita. So I close that parenthesis. But it explains why Our Lady here has this to say. I just quote a few bits. You know the statue which wept there at Akita? I am weeping because humanity does not receive my motherly invitation to conversion and to its return to the Lord. It goes on obstinately running along the road of rebellion against God and against his law of love. I'm offering, as I said, this Holy Mass to protect, with regard to abortion, the protection of the 8th Amendment. Well, listening to women over the years, one gets the other side of the story, and it's not actually merciful to make abortion easily available for somebody who's already a victim of abuse, because quite often these ladies are coping with something they didn't particularly want. And when you add this bit, it doesn't help at all, because they don't tell you, but we know what goes on afterwards. Each year they remember what had been the birthday and so on and so forth. It's a hugely profound experience, an abortion for a woman. But they won't talk about it. I close that parenthesis. The Lord is openly rejected, precisely in that context in Ireland, outraged and blasphemed, One can now, even on RTE, make jokes about not just things related to religion, but about the centre of it, the very core. Your Heavenly Mother is publicly despised and ridiculed. My extraordinary appeals are not accepted. The signs which I gave of my immense sorrow are not believed. Now it's interesting to see how we can, as it were, be one step ahead of heaven and be so sophisticated that we have grown out of the need for these interventions from on high. In Africa and in these countries, it's very different. The series of apparitions at Kibeho was very differently received down there, and strangely enough, even Muslims were joined into it. It's very interesting what happened actually before the outbreak of war down there. Now, I carry on here because it becomes more specific. Your neighbour is not loved. Every day there are attacks against his life and his property. Man is becoming increasingly corrupt, impious, wicked and cruel. Now this bit then becomes somewhat apocalyptic. We're being warned. With regard to Noah, it's not just a myth. There is sufficient evidence that the common strands coming through, for instance, Gilgamesh and these ancient non-Christian texts, Sumerian texts and so on, corresponding so closely to what we have coming from Genesis, indicate that there was a common human experience of a terrible flood. And also there has been quite a bit of research in the area where, according to Genesis, it did come to rest. And it's difficult to do it because of the territory owned by hostile forces. But it seems that they have picked up that there is a massive structure down there, underwater, which corresponds to the dimensions. Of course, it's all covered in what would grow over it by now. But nevertheless, it's curious. And it was a massive vessel, given the measurements given in the Bible itself, and it corresponds. It would have been well able to protect a large amount of life, animal and human. So in this context, if that were the case already then, when the likes of homosexuality was crying out to heaven, what would it be now, when it's now the norm? And this other stuff which they couldn't do, which we now can, which is crying now to the throne of heaven and to our Creator. We think we are in charge of Him, creating life as we want to. So we can expect. Now remember at Fatima how Our Lady did warn that this first war was going to come to an end shortly, but if people didn't change there would be a worse war, and she gave details. In the pontificate of a pontiff that didn't yet reign, it was correct, because it actually really broke out in 1938 when things started to move. And of course these lights and so on, seen in the air, which Hitler also saw, and with this force he saw them, this great terrible blood sign, as it were, in the air, and said to his generals, as they looked at this in the sky, it's going to take a lot of blood to pull this one off. So, therefore, Our Lady warned that this Second World War was therefore the consequence of what? Not listening. So there is therefore in human history this balance between good and evil, and if it's not taken on board by victim souls, Padre Pio, monks and nuns who have also that inbuilt in their system, making penance, if it's not happening, hence Our Lady asking for fasting and so on in recent times, if this is not happening, then it comes back to the whole planet. So in this context, what comes here would make sense. A punishment worse than the flood is about to fall on this poor and perverted humanity. Fire will come down from heaven, and this will be the sign the justice of God has already fixed the hour of His great manifestation. Now, this great manifestation I want to come into now. With regard to judgment, which this Gospel is about, it applies to the way that we mercifully look at each other's soul and talk about it. The old French saying holds true: tout savoir, c'est tout pardonner. To know everything is to pardon everything. That is to say, if we knew the inner dynamics of the soul before us, we wouldn't be quite so presumptuous. A lot of things are conditioned. We excuse ourselves very easily, do we not? We're not quite so generous when it comes to a person before us. So judgment then applies on that level, but then also it applies to our own judgment before God and our participation in it by in some way observing our own behavior in the eyes and not camouflaging it or justifying it. We have a right, I distinguish, between observing and then judging. There are three levels actually. One is observing, which we have the right to do, and even prudentially ought to do, so as to be aware. The second then is to, in some way, filter that consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously in the mind. It's bound to happen, we can't not, it's sort of automatic. We tend to attribute certain behavior patterns to certain motives, which we haven't quite the right to do, but we can observe a pattern emerging, therefore we can calculate. But then, again, the question of pronouncing a judgment formally with our minds, we shouldn't really do, but just be aware, because it can be useful to be aware that somebody has a tendency, okay? It's self-defense. But then the third part of emitting that judgment vocally and sharing it with other people then becomes, as it were, a pronouncing of sentence. That we haven't quite the right to do. Having said that, if one is handling, for instance, somebody's CV in an interview, or as a novice master talking about a vocation to receive or whatever, or for vows later on, then it's a bit different. It's objective handling of things, but always to know the truth and to make the right decision. On a need-to-know basis, as they say. But be careful, because gossip partakes in that. Gossip is interesting because we do a lot of that. It's colporting bits that do not need to be made known. Now, I land where I want to land. What the beard had to say. He passed on this, which was something which shook me to my foundation, and I'll try in a few words to sum it up. I've left a copy of it with Ellen on DVD. As it happens, I'm able to do that because I was given independently by the one who's doing the reproducing of it the other day at a funeral. Thomas McNally's in Derrynoose there in the north. And they're close to Des Monaghan, who lives in Middletown, Armagh, and has Ave Maria publications, and they produce little booklets and also DVDs, Garabandal and this kind of thing. It's a useful centre, a resource centre. So Des Monaghan, Ave Maria publications, Middletown, Armagh, and they can be got there. So this is a DVD which he mastered, or masterized, and it's called The Mini Judgment, and it goes something like this. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. The person who is giving it is a very good speaker, easy to listen to. He's 49 at the moment of delivering it, but he's not delivering his own experience because the person who had it did not want to go public on it. So he's doing it sort of anonymously, but his wife accidentally slipped out his name, Bruce. So I don't know what his surname is, but the subject of it therefore is Bruce, And this is what happened. This Bruce was a friend of the one who's speaking there in this DVD. He's kind of a lay evangelist, a Catholic lay evangelist. He goes around and talks very well. And an American. They had an agreement out of friendship that one day, the one who's talking here, this one, would go with his friend to his own church, and that he would make a return visit to the Catholic one. The friend, Bruce, was an American Anglican, an Episcopalian. So, friend went, prayed, and then Bruce came to the Catholic celebration, and unaware of what was right and what was wrong, went, but with devotion, to receive Holy Communion. So the Catholic friend calmly and quietly and with great tenderness explained, well, look, this is the situation with regard to the sacraments. It's not really correct to receive in the Catholic Church without being a Catholic. However, what you can do, anytime you want to, is go to the church down the road. It's St. Louis de Montfort, and there adoration is going on a lot of the time, and you can spend as much time as you want to adoring the host, the real presence, the Eucharist there in the monasteries. So that's what happened. And then something happened, which is the theme of this DVD. He came to his friend in a desperate state. He had an experience that he couldn't put into words. He had been shown, while before the Blessed Sacrament, his soul. He'd been given what judgment was, and with it an infused knowledge of the Catholic faith, that it was the only true church, even though, and he was made aware of this, there was within its human structure sin and evil. It was the true church. And this then was what he was given to understand with regard to the state of his soul. That if he died in that moment in time, in that state, he was going to spend the rest of time until the end of the world in purgatory. And the only way to avoid it was to receive absolution. And the only way to receive absolution was from a Catholic priest, although also a Greek priest had the power to give it. He was given to understand that. Now, he came therefore to his friend distraught, and he said, I have to have this thing that you call absolution. I have to have it now. Because if I don't, I'm going to die. And his friend was listening and couldn't understand, and explained, I'm going to die of a broken heart. And he was shown the horridness of sin and what it was doing to the Saviour. His friend wanted to know more. What has happened? And he told him that he had had this time, this moment, when all had stood still and he'd seen his soul and all his life, all the events from the age of reason, 7 or 8, first time round, seeing all the, now he used the term that he had familiar to him in the Anglican setup, deadly sins, but he added what you call mortal sins. He was shown them all, individually, from then until the age he had. And then he was shown, again, starting from the same age, all the sins that were intentional but not deadly, not mortal. And he gave the kind of example that he had been aware of something but had done it nevertheless, such as participating in the gossip around, this kind of thing. Each case, he'd seen it in that more than a flash, was protracted experience until the present time. And then he was shown a third wave. He talked about the three waves and said, before coming to it, you, as a practicing Catholic, will receive confession every week and communion every day, will probably not get the first two waves, but this one you will. And he added this. This is the one I just couldn't bear. After all the others, this was just unbearable. He saw what was coming to him already from any time that he'd been in a Catholic church where the real presence was and hadn't made a genuflection and so on, and he understood that this was the one that Catholics were going to come up against one day and have a terrible time with it. By the way, does that sound vaguely familiar in our day? Mm-hmm. Who is at work? And why is Our Lady weeping? What happened? His friend explained to him that confession and absolution could only happen normally in the case of a person who was Catholic. However, he did promise to consult a priest he knew, who was actually of the Mariamnute of priests and very erudite, balanced and orthodox and faithful and compassionate towards souls and a good listener, and got them to meet. So the good priest received him, and because of this that he had said, that he was going to die, because the other one I thought first he meant suicide, but he explained, no, not one bit, a broken heart, that he couldn't bear another 24 hours without absolution. The other one did make appeal in his mind to what canon law allows for a situation of near death, and received a confession which lasted an hour and a half, in which he divulged his whole life history and soul. Then the other man, the friend of Bruce, wanted to know what the next stage was. He was leaving the Anglican Church and entering the Catholic Church. So it was being regularized. But the friend who was transmitting the testimony gave us to understand that he had received, and this is the whole point, the mini judgment. And that this is what it's going to be for all the dwellers on earth. There will be a moment of warning. Time will stand still and we'll all see our soul. Now, this, as you know, is familiar from prophecy. We don't know when it's going to happen, but it would make sense, because given that objectively the state of planet Earth right now is worse than ever it has been in the history of mankind, the consequences also can but be in proportion. And therefore, to obvert the worst possible, the Lord, who is compassion and love, is probably going to give us this chance, lest we go into what we ourselves have created for ourselves without awareness. Because if we go into the beyond as we are, what work have we yet to do in purgatory or worse? Mm-hmm.